Chapter 1: The Unseen Gap. Emily Jenkins had always been a trailblazer. A self-made billionaire and the founder of Jenkins Bank, her name was synonymous with success, innovation, and social responsibility. She had built her empire from the ground up, ensuring that the bank's foundation was built on principles of diversity, inclusivity, and fairness. Over the years, she had become a champion of equality in the financial world, positioning Jenkins Bank as a beacon of hope for those seeking accessible and respectful banking services. Emily was well aware of the responsibilities that came with her position. She often spoke at conferences, encouraging other financial institutions to adopt more inclusive policies. Her dedication to fairness had earned her the admiration of peers, employees, and customers alike. But recently, a growing sense of unease had been creeping into her mind. There were whispers, subtle but persistent, that something wasn't right within some of her branches. Customers had shared stories about feeling mistreated or ignored, especially at certain locations. It wasn't enough to make headlines, but the whispers had taken root in Emily's mind. She began hearing accounts of discriminatory practices, especially regarding how certain groups of people were being treated by staff. None of the stories were overt. Nothing screamed scandal or injustice. It was more a feeling of discomfort, of being out of place, that customers were experiencing. At first, Emily had brushed it all off. Her bank had strict anti-discrimination policies in place, and her leadership team was made up of people she trusted. Surely, these were just isolated incidents, nothing more than a misunderstanding. But the more she reflected on it, the more persistent the doubts became. Could it be possible that something as foundational as fairness wasn't being consistently enforced in her own company? The question gnawed at her, and she found herself lying awake late at night, the weight of her suspicions pressing on her chest. As the CEO, she was constantly surrounded by yes men and high-level executives who agreed with her vision and reinforced the idea that everything was running smoothly. But was it? Was Jenkins Bank truly as inclusive as Emily believed it to be? Determined to find the truth, Emily decided to investigate on her own, without the mask of power and authority that came with her position. She would visit one of her branches, but this time, not as the CEO, just a regular customer, blending into the crowd. She needed to see the reality of what was happening on the ground, away from the polished boardrooms and scripted reports. The idea was simple: go undercover. Experience what the average customer might face when they walked into a Jenkins Bank branch. Emily planned to dress down. No expensive blazers or designer shoes, just a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. She wasn't looking for preferential treatment. She wanted to understand what others experienced without any biases attached to her name or position. After deciding on the branch she would visit, Emily's heart raced a little as she prepared for what could very well be an uncomfortable experience. She pulled into the parking lot of the Indianapolis branch, one she had personally approved for expansion just a few years ago. It had been a proud moment for her, the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the speeches, the photographs. She had spoken about how trust would be the cornerstone of her bank's success. Today, however, she wasn't here as the founder. Today, she was just another woman walking into a bank. She adjusted her bag and walked through the automatic doors, the cold rush of air from the air conditioning greeting her. The lobby smelled of fresh paper and industrial air fresheners, the typical scent of a corporate environment. She glanced around, noting that it was a quiet afternoon, a few customers in line, a couple of others seated in the waiting area. The teller at the far end of the room was balancing a cash drawer, looking distracted. As she approached the counter, Emily prepared herself for what she hoped would be an ordinary transaction, but something inside her already told her that today might be different. This wasn't just about making a withdrawal. It was about seeing if the values she had championed for years were actually being upheld in her own company. Chapter 2: The Quiet Visit. Emily Jenkins stepped out of her car and into the cool morning air of Indianapolis, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She had driven to this branch not as the founder and CEO of Jenkins Bank, but as an ordinary customer, someone just like the many individuals who walk through the doors each day. She was dressed simply, intentionally blending in with the crowd, a plain gray hoodie, faded jeans, and a pair of well-worn sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she had left her usual designer bag at home, opting for a simple crossbody instead. She wasn't here for recognition or preferential treatment. She needed to see the bank's operations through the eyes of a regular person, someone who wasn't defined by the title of CEO, but by the experience of simply being a customer. As Emily approached the entrance, she felt a sense of anticipation and a touch of nervousness. This was uncharted territory. Though she had championed inclusivity and fairness within her organization, could it be that her assumptions were wrong? She was about to find out. The lobby was bustling with activity. A few customers waited in line while others chatted quietly with tellers. The branch had a steady hum of business, the air thick with the sounds of keyboards tapping and the quiet shuffle of papers. The tellers were going about their work, dealing with various transactions. Emily could hear snippets of conversations from other customers. It felt like any other banking experience, and yet something inside her told her that today would be different. She walked up to a counter where a young teller, no older than 25, stood balancing a cash drawer. The teller barely glanced up as Emily approached, her face neutral. Emily smiled at her, but the young woman didn't return the gesture. She simply reached for a form without saying a word and slid it toward Emily. "Please fill this out," the teller said curtly. It was a standard withdrawal form: name, account number, and withdrawal amount. Emily filled it out quickly, the numbers coming easily. She asked for $7,000, a modest sum for someone in her position, but enough to require verification. She slid the form back to the teller and waited, expecting the process to continue without issue. But the moment the form hit the counter, something shifted in the air. The teller's demeanor subtly changed. She looked at Emily's ID with a momentary pause before quickly glancing back at her computer screen. There was a small frown, a flicker of hesitation, as if something was wrong. Emily's stomach tightened slightly. She could feel it, a subtle shift in the energy of the bank. She wasn't just another customer. She was being judged. Chapter 3, Tension Builds with the First Teller. Emily stood at the counter, silently waiting as Alicia, the young teller, glanced at her ID and then at her computer screen. Alicia's demeanor was cold and serious, with an air of professionalism that bordered on distant. She was in her early 20s, pale complexion framed by dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail. Her face was expressionless, her movements quick and precise, but there was something about the way she looked at Emily that unsettled her. Alicia took longer than usual to process Emily's withdrawal request. There was no warmth in her interaction, no smile, no greeting. Emily tried to make small talk, hoping to break the ice, but Alicia remained focused on her screen, as though Emily didn't even exist beyond the transaction she was conducting. "Is it a busy day?" Emily asked, attempting to sound casual. Alicia didn't look up. "Not really," she replied flatly, her attention unwavering. Emily's smile faded, and she felt an uncomfortable shift in the air. She had expected more of a response, some basic level of customer service, but Alicia's cold indifference made it clear that she was just another person in line, another customer to be processed. The teller handed Emily a form to fill out, as if it were a routine procedure. The withdrawal request for $7,000 was hardly anything to make a fuss about, yet Alicia's reluctance to engage was palpable. Emily filled in the details and slid the form back across the counter, trying to ignore the subtle unease creeping up her spine. Alicia didn't immediately grab the form. Instead, she looked at it for a moment longer than necessary, scanning it with an odd intensity. Then, she slowly picked it up, her fingers lingering on the paper as if unsure of what to do next. Emily noticed the slight hesitation in Alicia's actions, the way she studied her ID as though searching for something that wasn't there. A flicker of judgment passed through Alicia's eyes before she quickly looked back at the computer. The movement was almost imperceptible, but Emily caught it. She had been scrutinized, not as a customer, but as a problem. It was a feeling Emily knew all too well, the feeling of being measured and found wanting. The subtle shift in Alicia's body language, the brief pause, spoke volumes. It wasn't about the money. It was about who Emily was, how she was perceived. "Everything seems fine," Alicia said abruptly, her voice flat. But Emily could feel the weight of the words, and the tension in the air was thickening, leaving her with an unsettling certainty that this was no ordinary transaction. Chapter 4, First Confrontation with Manager. Emily stood in silence, her eyes following Alicia as the young teller walked briskly toward the back office, clutching her withdrawal form. The minutes stretched out, each second adding to the growing tension in the lobby. Emily's patience was beginning to wear thin, but she refused to let it show. She had come in seeking a simple transaction, not to be treated like an outsider. As she waited, Emily noticed a pattern that only seemed to deepen her unease. Other customers, particularly white men, were being greeted promptly, without the slightest hesitation. One man, dressed in a slightly wrinkled suit, approached the counter, and the teller immediately smiled, welcoming him with a polite, "Good afternoon, sir." Another customer, a middle-aged woman in a floral dress, was attended to right away by a different teller, engaging in a pleasant conversation while her transaction was swiftly processed. Emily couldn't help but compare her treatment to theirs. She had been standing there for several minutes, yet no one had even offered her a word of explanation. She was being ignored, her presence seemingly deemed less worthy of attention. Minutes later, Emily's suspicion was confirmed when John Davis, the branch manager, appeared. A middle-aged man with a well-tailored business suit and a thin, forced smile, John approached the counter with the same air of professionalism, though it lacked warmth. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I understand you're trying to make a withdrawal," he said, his voice calm, but with an underlying tone of calculation. Emily nodded, keeping her composure. "Yes, $7,000 from my personal account. I've already filled out the form." She gestured toward the clipboard, trying to maintain a professional tone despite the growing frustration in her chest. John glanced at the form for a brief moment, then looked at her with a practiced smile. "May I see your ID, please?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. She was already holding her ID in her hand, and she had provided it to Alicia only moments ago. It wasn't standard procedure to ask for ID again for a routine withdrawal of this size. She was starting to feel the weight of the situation, sensing that this wasn't just about bank policies. Something deeper was at play. With a deep breath, Emily handed over her ID without saying a word. She watched as John scrutinized it, his expression neutral but distant. Emily's mind raced as she tried to remain calm. Why was she being treated differently? Was it because of her appearance? Was there something about her that made her less trustworthy in their eyes? She had been a customer at this bank from day one, and yet here she was, being questioned in a way that no other customer seemed to be. As the silence hung between them, Emily's suspicions grew stronger. This wasn't just about policy. This was something else entirely. Chapter 5, Escalation of Doubts. Emily stood there, watching John Davis as he examined her ID with an intensity that seemed out of proportion for a simple transaction. Her patience was wearing thin. It had been over 10 minutes since she first approached the counter, and each moment felt like it was further escalating from a routine withdrawal into something much more personal. John placed her ID down on the counter and glanced at the computer screen, his fingers hovering above the keyboard, as though deciding what to do next. His face was carefully neutral, but there was an underlying tension in his posture. He wasn't just reviewing her information, he was scrutinizing her presence, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that this was not about banking policy, it was about something else. "Miss Jenkins," he began, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of formality, "I'm going to need to ask a few more questions to verify your identity. These are just standard precautions for large withdrawals." Emily's heart sank. She had provided her ID, filled out the necessary form, and had been a customer at this branch since it opened. Yet now she was being asked unnecessary questions as if she were a stranger. "Standard precautions?" she repeated, keeping her voice steady. "What kind of questions?" John looked down at the screen and then at her, as if considering his next words carefully. "Can you tell me the last deposit amount made into this account? Just for verification purposes." Emily blinked. That wasn't standard procedure. Not for a withdrawal of this size, and certainly not after providing valid identification. This was starting to feel more like an interrogation than a transaction. She inhaled sharply, fighting the frustration rising in her chest. This wasn't about security. This was about something else entirely. She could feel the tension in her jaw, but she kept her voice calm. "John," she said, leaning slightly forward, "if I were a man in a tailored suit, would you be asking me these questions?" John hesitated, his fingers hovering above the keyboard for just a moment too long. Emily watched his expression shift subtly, a flicker of discomfort that quickly masked itself with a forced smile. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his tone patronizingly polite, "this is just standard procedure. We need to ensure that all transactions are legitimate." Emily held his gaze, her voice sharp now. "I've been banking here for years, and I'm being treated like this because of what? Because of what I'm wearing? Or because of how you think I look?" John shifted his stance, but he didn't back down. "This is policy, Miss Jenkins. We take security seriously." His words, though coded in politeness, had the effect of making Emily feel increasingly dismissed. The excuse was too convenient, too rehearsed. Emily's suspicions grew stronger with every word. Her intuition was telling her this wasn't about security at all. It was about something deeper. Bias. She had seen it before, felt it in the way people judged others based on assumptions. Now here she was, experiencing it firsthand. "Security?" Emily repeated, her voice now icy. "So, if I look different, dressed differently, would I still be treated like this? I'm just asking because I'm starting to get the feeling that you're treating me like I don't belong here." John's face remained stoic, but she could see the brief flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Emily's frustration was reaching its peak, and her patience was running out. His refusal to acknowledge the underlying issue only made her more certain of what was happening. John may have been trying to hide behind policies, but Emily wasn't going to let him get away with it. The real question wasn't about security. It was about who gets to be treated with dignity and respect, and who doesn't. Chapter 6: The Final Straw. Emily stood at the counter, her mind racing as John Davis continued to fumble for excuses. She had tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, but now the truth was clear. This wasn't a simple banking error or a procedural mistake. It was about how she was being treated based on assumptions about her appearance and status. She had walked in that morning hoping to be just another customer, but now she realized she was being judged not by her account history, but by the way she looked. John had already questioned her identity unnecessarily, pushed her to prove her legitimacy, and refused to back down despite her calm and reasonable requests. The more he spoke, the more it became evident that his reluctance to process her transaction had nothing to do with security. It had everything to do with her and how they perceived her. "This isn't about security, John," Emily said, her voice now sharp with frustration. "You're treating me differently because of how I look. You've made assumptions about me based on appearances, and it's completely unacceptable." John's expression remained controlled, but the thin veneer of politeness was starting to crack. He didn't respond immediately, instead giving a slight nod as if processing her words. But there was no apology, no recognition of her frustration. It was as if he hadn't heard her at all. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave," John finally said, his tone too calm, almost dismissive. "We can't proceed with the transaction at this time." Emily's chest tightened and her mind spun. Was he really going to ask her to leave the bank she built? This wasn't just a refusal to process a simple withdrawal. This was an effort to dismiss her, to push her out. "Are you calling security?" Emily asked, her voice low but steady. John didn't answer, but his eyes flickered toward the back of the branch. That was all the confirmation she needed. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This was deliberate. He was trying to control her, to make her feel like she didn't belong here. It was intimidation, pure and simple. Moments later, a security guard stepped into view. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his uniform pressed sharply. He walked toward the counter, his eyes scanning Emily with an unreadable expression. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his voice flat. Emily looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "That depends," she replied coolly. "Are you here to help me access my money or just to escort me out?" The guard hesitated, glancing briefly at John, whose posture had stiffened. Emily's gut clenched. This was no longer about banking. It was about control. It was about making her feel unwelcome, like she didn't have the right to be there. The guard's presence only confirmed her suspicions. They saw her as a problem, an unwelcome customer, someone to be escorted out rather than helped. But Emily wasn't going to back down. She was calm, but inside the anger simmered. She knew this was a direct challenge, one she wasn't going to let go unanswered. Chapter 7. Revealing the Truth. The tension in the bank was suffocating. Emily stood her ground, her heart pounding with the quiet intensity of the moment. She had already given John Davis more than enough chances to rectify the situation, but now it was clear that this was no simple misunderstanding. The discrimination she had felt from the very beginning was real. It wasn't about a routine transaction or bank policies. It was about her being judged based on assumptions about her appearance and status. She had been scrutinized unfairly, and John's insistence on questioning her identity was nothing more than an effort to dismiss her. Despite the mounting frustration, Emily remained calm, her voice steady and controlled. She had made her point, but now it was time for John to understand the gravity of what he had done. Reaching into her bag, Emily pulled out her Jenkins Bank CEO business card, the embossed lettering glinting in the dim light of the bank. She held it up for John to see, letting him take in the unmistakable name on the card. The calm authority in her eyes made it clear that this was not just some random customer standing before him. "I am Emily Jenkins, founder and CEO of Jenkins Bank," she said, her voice low but unmistakably firm. John's confident, almost smug expression faltered. The color drained from his face as he processed her words, his gaze flicking between the card and Emily. The air in the room shifted instantly. Panic replaced the earlier sense of superiority he had projected. The facade he had been hiding behind shattered in an instant. The security guard, who had been standing rigidly behind Emily, seemed to soften at the realization. His stance relaxed, the once intimidating presence now unsure and hesitant. Alicia, the teller, who had been quietly observing the exchange, looked up with wide eyes. The shock was evident on her face, and Emily could see the moment when she understood who she was dealing with. Emily didn't allow the silence to drag on. She pushed forward, her voice calm but sharp. "I personally approved the opening of this branch. I signed off on the staff, including you, John." Her eyes locked with his, and she could see the shame creeping into his posture. "You may not have recognized me, but I am the one who gave you this job, and I am the one who built this institution, this bank, this branch. I made it possible." The weight of Emily's words settled over the room. John's eyes widened, the reality of his mistake slowly sinking in. He had no more excuses. His attempt to dismiss her, to treat her like a problem, had just backfired in the most dramatic way. Emily didn't raise her voice, didn't let anger take over. Instead, it was her quiet confidence that commanded the room now. She could feel the atmosphere shift, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of realization in John's eyes. He had seriously misjudged the situation, and more importantly, he had misjudged her. "Now, John," Emily said, her tone smooth but resolute, "it's time for you to recognize who you're really dealing with." Chapter 8. Power Struggle. The moment of revelation had shifted the power dynamic in the room. Emily stood tall, holding the weight of her identity as the founder and CEO of Jenkins Bank, and she wasn't about to let John Davis or anyone else treat her like just another customer. The tension in the bank felt palpable, a quiet hum of realization echoing around the room. She wasn't just a regular person standing at a counter. She was the one who had built this institution, the one whose vision had made this branch and every other possible. "John," she began, her voice calm but laced with authority, "I'm not just another customer here. I built this bank from the ground up, and yet here I stand being questioned, scrutinized, and treated like I'm an outsider." She could see the discomfort flash across his face. He shifted uncomfortably, but Emily didn't let up. She stepped closer, leaning slightly forward, forcing him to face the truth she was about to lay bare. "You and Alicia have let your biases control this situation. You assume that just because I don't fit the image of the typical important customer, I'm somehow unworthy of basic respect. But that's not how this works. It's not supposed to work like this." John opened his mouth, as if to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Emily pressed on, not giving him a chance to deflect. "Tell me, John," she continued, her voice steady but sharp, "why was I refused service? Why was I treated differently than a man in a suit who came up right before me? You didn't question him at all. What makes him worthy of your attention, but not me? John's face turned an uncomfortable shade of red. He stammered, fumbling for an answer that didn't come. I I didn't mean, it wasn't, he began, but his words trailed off. The apology he was offering felt empty, rehearsed. He was trapped now, exposed for what he had done. Emily's eyes never wavered from his. She wasn't done yet. You didn't mean to treat me this way? She asked, her voice cold. That's not good enough, John. You can't just apologize and expect this to go away. You need to answer for why you treated me differently. And I need you to look at the truth. She took a deep breath, letting the silence linger before pressing further. If I were someone else, if I were a man, if I looked different, would I still be facing this kind of scrutiny? Or would I have been treated with the respect I deserve from the moment I stepped in here? John's jaw tightened. He could no longer hide behind the facade of professionalism. Emily had forced him to confront what had been simmering beneath the surface all along, his own prejudices. He didn't answer right away, and the silence between them hung heavy. Emily was not backing down. This wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that no one else would face this kind of treatment in the future. You need to face the truth, John, Emily said, her voice unwavering. This is the kind of behavior I won't tolerate, and it will not stand in my bank. Chapter 9. Changing the System. The weight of the moment hung in the air as Emily stood there, her phone raised slightly, capturing every word, every glance, every subtle movement. She wasn't going to let John or Alicia off the hook. This wasn't just about a failed transaction. It was about accountability. It was about proving that Jenkins Bank would not tolerate discrimination, no matter who it was directed toward. As John stood there, his face flushed and eyes darting between her and the security guard, Emily made it clear. She had the evidence. The phone in her hand was recording everything, a silent witness to the unjust treatment she had endured. Let's make one thing clear, John, Emily said, her voice calm but resolute. This is being recorded. I will make sure that this incident doesn't just disappear. You have two choices. You can admit what happened here today, take responsibility for your actions, and we can move forward from this. Or you can continue to lie, pretend nothing happened, and face the full scrutiny of Jenkins Bank's corporate leadership. John's eyes widened in horror as he realized the gravity of the situation. Alicia, who had been standing quietly beside him, looked nervously from one to the other, as if searching for a way out. Emily paused, letting her words sink in. She wasn't backing down. She was done with excuses and denials. You think this is going away? She asked, her tone hardening. It's not. I'm holding you accountable for your actions today, and Jenkins Bank will not allow this behavior to continue. I don't care if this is a small mistake in your eyes. The way you treated me, how you scrutinized me because of your own biases, is unacceptable. And it's not just about me. It's about every customer who comes through this door and faces discrimination. She took a deep breath and looked directly at John and Alicia. I'm scheduling a meeting with the corporate team tomorrow morning. Every single branch manager will be there. We will be reviewing this policy and introducing new ones, anti-bias training, accountability systems, and clear procedures for reporting discrimination at all levels. This will be addressed, and it will change immediately. Emily's words were firm, but her gaze was steady. She wasn't just the founder of this bank. She was its protector, and she would ensure that her vision was fully realized. This incident would be the turning point. Expect my call, she added, because I won't allow Jenkins Bank to stand for anything less than a culture of fairness and respect. Not now, not ever. With that, Emily turned and walked away, leaving John and Alicia standing in the tension of their own making. They had been exposed, and now they had no choice but to face the consequences. Emily's calm confidence was the last word, and the change she promised was already in motion. Chapter 10. Resolution. The morning after the confrontation, Emily stood in the conference room, facing the members of her corporate leadership team. The room was filled with tension, the gravity of the previous day's events still hanging in the air. Emily had made it clear that the bank's culture was going to change, and she wasn't wasting any time. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Jenkins Bank, she began, her voice steady and commanding. What happened yesterday cannot be allowed to happen again, not at this branch, and certainly not at any of our branches. It's time for us to take real action. She went on to explain the immediate steps she had implemented: mandatory anti-bias training for all employees across every branch. No one, from the tellers to the branch managers, would be exempt. Emily had already scheduled the first session for the following week, led by industry experts in diversity and inclusion. She knew that this wasn't just about teaching employees what was wrong. It was about creating a deeper cultural shift in how Jenkins Bank operated. Emily also introduced a new anonymous reporting system for customers, giving them a safe space to voice their concerns about unfair treatment. She knew that real change couldn't come from top-down policies alone. The people working directly with customers needed to be held accountable, and the customers themselves needed to know their voices would be heard. We will also revisit our customer service policies, she continued, with an emphasis on diversity, inclusivity, and respect. Every branch manager will be responsible for ensuring that these new practices are followed, and they will be held accountable for their staff's actions. Emily turned her attention to the personnel decisions. John Davis will no longer be a part of Jenkins Bank. His actions and his inability to act appropriately when confronted with discrimination have made it clear he cannot lead our team. We will be replacing him with someone who embodies the values we stand for. A murmur spread through the room as Emily's words sank in. The firing of John Davis wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was the first step toward resetting the bank's values. She had no tolerance for leadership that didn't reflect the standards she set for the organization. As for Alicia, Emily said, her voice unwavering, she will undergo a formal review process. I need to remind everyone here that no one is above scrutiny. Not John, not Alicia, and certainly not any of you. Everyone, regardless of position, is held to the same standards of respect and accountability. She paused, making sure her words had the intended impact. The silence in the room was thick with understanding. This wasn't just about punishing one person. It was about setting the tone for everyone at Jenkins Bank. Emily was committed to making sure that the culture of respect, fairness, and inclusivity she had built would be upheld, no matter what. Change starts now, Emily concluded, and it starts with each one of you. Let's make sure we build a place where no customer is ever made to feel like they don't belong. The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Emily knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was in the follow-through, the changes that would take place day in and day out in every interaction with every customer. But as she looked around the room at her leadership team, Emily felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just a business to her. It was a reflection of her values, and she would ensure that it always stood for what was right. Chapter 11, Final Reflection. As Emily sat in her office late one evening, the weight of the past few days settled on her shoulders. The events at the bank had left an indelible mark on her, and while the immediate fallout had been addressed, she knew the real work was just beginning. Her fingers drummed lightly on her desk as she looked out the window, reflecting on the changes she had set in motion at Jenkins Bank. Real change, she realized, could never come from policies alone. It had to be backed by action. The way forward wasn't about sweeping the issue under the rug. It was about confronting the bias, privilege, and discrimination that had silently woven themselves into the fabric of her organization. Emily knew that this kind of systemic change required more than just top-down directives. It required personal responsibility from those in positions of power. As the founder and CEO, she had the ability and the duty to dismantle the systems that perpetuated inequality. It wasn't enough to talk about fairness, inclusivity, and accountability. These values had to be integrated into every part of Jenkins Bank, from the way customers were treated to the expectations placed on every employee. Emily's decisions had been bold, but she knew they were necessary. She could feel the shift within the bank. It was becoming a place where respect was no longer optional, where every individual, regardless of their background or appearance, was given the same dignity. The firing of John Davis, the implementation of mandatory anti-bias training, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting system were just the beginning. These actions signaled that Jenkins Bank was no longer going to turn a blind eye to discrimination. Emily was determined to ensure that the bank's commitment to equality was not just a slogan, but a lived experience for both employees and customers. As she reflected on the changes, she felt a sense of pride. She had taken a stand. She had used her power to make sure that no customer would ever be treated like she had been. But more than that, she had created an environment where those who were once invisible, those who had been ignored or dismissed, would be seen and heard. This story was not just about one incident. It was a reminder that bias and privilege are deeply embedded in the structures around us, and that real progress can only happen when those with power use it to make a difference. For Emily, the lesson was clear. True leadership required courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths in order to create a better future. Jenkins Bank was now on a path aligned with the values Emily had always championed. The journey was far from over, but with the steps she had already taken, she knew the bank was heading in the right direction, toward a future where fairness, inclusivity, and accountability were not just ideals, but the foundation of everything they did. The story of Emily Jenkins and the discrimination she faced at her own bank highlights a crucial lesson that resonates in our everyday lives. Real change comes when those in positions of power take responsibility for dismantling systems that perpetuate inequality. Whether in the workplace or in society, we all play a role in either reinforcing or challenging biases. Just as Emily used her influence to create systemic change within Jenkins Bank, each of us can challenge prejudices in our own environments. It's not enough to simply recognize injustice. We must act. The story shows that accountability and transparency are key in creating inclusive spaces where everyone feels valued and respected. It reminds us that biases, both subtle and overt, need to be addressed head-on, and that action, not just words, is what drives real progress. We all have the power to make a difference, and change begins with how we respond to these issues in our daily lives.